Delilah Mercer had nothing left but nerve and a leather satchel she never let out of her grip. When she stepped off the stage in Garrison, Wyoming, the whole town stopped to stare. Not with welcome, but with the kind of cold, measuring silence that tells a woman exactly where she stands. She'd survived worse than their stares. What she hadn't counted on was how fast a strange frontier town could turn dangerous, or how quickly one quiet, hard-eyed rancher would change the entire course of her life. If this story moves something in you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this journey travels. The stagecoach came in 2 hours late, which was considered on time for the Garrison line. The driver had pushed the horses hard through the last stretch of mountain road, cursing the ruts left by spring runoff and the gray sky that had been threatening snow since morning. By the time the coach rattled to a stop in front of Garrison's only hotel, a 2-story building with a crooked sign that read Hartwell's and a front porch that leaned noticeably to the left, the passengers were stiff, dust-covered, and grateful for solid ground. 3 men climbed out first: a cattle broker in a wool coat, a young man with soft hands who worked for the Territorial Land Office, a minister with tired eyes who'd been praying quietly for the last 40 miles. They stepped down and moved along the boardwalk without looking back. Then Delilah Mercer climbed out. She didn't step down so much as unfold herself from the cramped interior. A tall woman, lean in the way that comes from too many skipped meals rather than any particular vanity, with dark hair pinned up under a hat that had seen better days. Her dress was plain gray wool, well made once but worn at the cuffs now, and she carried a single leather satchel over one shoulder that she'd kept in her lap the entire 11-hour ride. The other passengers had noticed. She hadn't cared. She stood on the step for a moment and looked at Garrison, Wyoming, with the expression of someone taking inventory of a situation they already half expected to be bad. The town was small. A main street of hard-packed dirt, running maybe 400 yards end to end, lined with wooden storefronts and the occasional gap where a building had burned down and nobody had gotten around to replacing it. A feed store, a general goods, a land office with the territorial flag hanging limp in the still air. 2 saloons, one on each end of the street, as if the town needed to be bracketed by them. A church that looked newer than everything else, its white paint not yet weathered to gray. Mountains in every direction, close and enormous and indifferent. There were maybe 20 people visible on the street at that moment. Within 30 seconds of Delilah stepping off that stage, most of them had stopped what they were doing to look at her. She was used to being looked at. She was not used to liking it. She stepped down onto the boardwalk and adjusted the satchel strap on her shoulder, and she kept her face perfectly neutral as she took in the stairs. A pair of women outside the dry goods store leaned toward each other. A man in a leather apron paused in sweeping his steps. 2 cowboys sitting on a hitching rail with their boots dangling exchanged a look she'd learned to read years ago. The particular look that men give a woman they've already decided they understand. She walked toward the hotel. She made it maybe 15 feet. Well now, the voice came from the left side of the boardwalk, from a man leaning against the post outside Garrison's second saloon. He was large, not tall, but broad in the chest and thick through the neck, with a face gone red and soft from drink even at this hour of the morning. He wore a ranch hand's clothes, worn and stained, and he had a flask in one hand that he'd apparently been working on for some time. His name, Delilah would learn later, was Denny Pruitt, and he worked, when he worked, on the Bellman spread east of town. At this particular moment, he was several drinks past any sense of proportion. "Where you headed, sweetheart?" Delilah didn't stop walking. "Hey, I'm talking to you." He pushed off the post and stepped into her path, not blocking her entirely, but close enough to make his intention clear. "Don't see many women like you coming through Garrison." She stopped. Not because she was afraid of him, she'd faced down worse than Denny Pruitt, but because she understood that whatever happened next was going to define every interaction she had in this town for as long as she stayed here. That was how these places worked. You either established yourself in the first 5 minutes, or you spent the next year clawing back ground. She looked at him, steady, flat, unmoved. "Women like me." Something in her tone made him blink, but he was drunk enough to push forward anyway. "You know what I mean, all dressed up, coming in on the stage alone." He grinned, and it was an ugly thing. "What kind of work you looking for exactly?" There was a ripple of something through the street. A few people had turned more fully now. The 2 women outside the dry goods store had gone still. Delilah shifted the satchel on her shoulder. She looked at Denny Pruitt for a long 3 seconds, long enough that his grin started to waver at the edges. And then she said, in a voice that carried exactly as far as she intended it to, "The kind of work that doesn't require me to talk to men who smell like they've been fermenting since Tuesday." Someone laughed. One of the cowboys on the hitching rail quickly smothered. Pruitt's face went from red to a darker shade. "That's a hell of a mouth for a woman who doesn't know a soul in this town." "I know myself," Delilah said. "That's generally enough." She moved to step around him. He moved with her, putting himself back in her path. And this time it wasn't ambiguous. His hand came out and closed around her arm just above the elbow. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to stop her. And his face had gone past drunk amusement into something uglier. "You want to think before you get smart with me," he said, low now, his voice dropping in that particular way that men drop their voices when they want to make sure a woman understands the nature of the threat. "You don't have any friends here." Delilah looked down at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up at him. And what was in her eyes was not fear. It was something much older and much colder than fear. The particular calm of a woman who has already survived the worst version of this situation and knows exactly what she's capable of. "Take your hand off me," she said, quietly. "Right now." "Or what?" She dropped the satchel from her shoulder, caught the strap before it hit the ground, and swung it in a single smooth arc directly into the side of Denny Pruitt's head. The sound it made was substantial. The ledger pages packed inside that bag were dense and heavy, and the impact snapped his head sideways and knocked him off balance. He stumbled back against the saloon post, and his flask hit the boardwalk and rolled off into the street, and he sat down hard on the wooden planks with his hand pressed to the side of his head, looking up at her with an expression that had passed entirely through shock and was working its way toward fury. The street had gone completely quiet. Delilah picked up the satchel, settled the strap back on her shoulder, and looked at him sitting there on the boards. "Don't get up," she said. He got up anyway, slowly, bracing against the post, and when he was on his feet his face had gone ugly in a way that had nothing to do with drink anymore. His hand went toward his belt. The crowd on the street took a collective half-step backward. Delilah did not step back. She stood with the satchel at her side and looked at Denny Pruitt coming toward her, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that she was very tired. She was tired of men like this. She was tired of having to be harder than was comfortable, meaner than was natural, and more alone than she'd ever wanted to be. She was tired of running, and she was tired of fighting, and she was tired of the way the world kept putting this same test in front of her, as if she might eventually fail it. She wasn't going to fail it, but she also wasn't entirely sure she wasn't about to get badly hurt. "That's enough." The voice came from across the street. Not loud. In fact, it was spoken at a normal conversational volume, which somehow made it cut through the tension more effectively than shouting would have. It was a voice that had the particular texture of someone accustomed to being listened to, not because of any position of authority, but simply because they'd learned at some point that they would be. Delilah looked toward it. The man was standing at the edge of the boardwalk across the street, beside a horse that was tied to the rail, a big gray animal with trail dust on its flanks. He'd apparently been there for at least part of this, watching. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, in the way of a man who works hard rather than the way of a man who is merely large, and he wore simple range clothes, a denim jacket gone pale at the elbows, canvas trousers, boots that had never been fashionable but were clearly made to last, dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that had been out in the wind and sun long enough to be permanently weathered, with lines around the eyes that might have been from squinting or might have been from something else. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't moving with any particular urgency. He simply walked across the street and inserted himself into the situation with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already decided how this was going to end. "Denny," he said, coming to a stop between Delilah and the ranch hand. "Go home." Pruitt's face worked through several expressions. "Ryder, this ain't your business. I'm making it mine." He said it without heat, without drama, just a flat statement of fact. Something shifted in Pruitt's expression, the calculation that drunks do when they're assessing whether the fight they're considering is actually worth having. He looked at the man called Ryder for a long moment, and then he looked at Delilah, and then he spat on the boardwalk and turned and walked back into the saloon, letting the door bang shut behind him. The crowd on the street exhaled collectively and began, slowly, to return to its own business. The man turned to face Delilah. Up close he was older than she'd first thought, mid-40s maybe, though the mountains had a way of aging people past their years. His eyes were a gray that matched his horse, watchful without being sharp, and he looked at her not with the assessing calculation of Pruitt or the curious stares of the townspeople, but with something that was closer to straightforward appraisal. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. It came out sharper than she meant it to, habit more than anything. "I didn't need the rescue." "No," he agreed. "You didn't. That bag of yours hit pretty solid." He paused. "He would have drawn on you, though." She knew that. She'd known it in the moment. Then I would have dealt with it. Maybe. He looked at her for another moment, and she had the uncomfortable sense that he was seeing considerably more than she meant to show. "Where are you headed?" "The hotel. I need a room." He glanced at Hartwell's, then back at her. Something moved briefly across his face. "They won't give you one. Hartwell won't rent to a woman alone. House rule." Delilah stared at him. "That's—" She stopped herself from finishing the sentence because the word she was reaching for was the honest one, and she was standing in the middle of a town she'd just arrived in. "That's unreasonable," she said instead. "It's Garrison," he said, as if that explained it. And maybe it did. She looked up and down the street, doing the same inventory she'd done getting off the stage, and she felt the particular sensation she'd been fighting off for weeks now, the cold understanding that there was nowhere to go. She'd come here because she thought a frontier town was far enough, remote enough, unknown enough. She'd come here because she thought distance was a form of safety. But if she couldn't get a room, she couldn't stay. And if she couldn't stay, she had nowhere. The next stage wasn't for 3 days. She had enough money for perhaps another week, and after that she had nothing except the contents of the satchel, which she couldn't spend and couldn't tell anyone about, and which had already gotten her into more trouble than she'd ever expected to find herself in. She was very tired. The man named Ryder was still watching her, not with pity. She would have turned and walked into the open country before she accepted pity, but with something more neutral than that. He seemed to be working something through in his own mind. "There's another option," he said, if you want it." She looked at him directly. "What kind of option?" I was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense he was choosing his words with some care. "I've got a homestead up in the mountain. Working ranch, 3 years running. I'm out here in town because I needed supplies and because—" He paused again. "Because I've got some business I haven't finished, but I've got a spare room, a solid roof, and work that needs doing that I haven't been able to manage alone." He met her eyes. "Decent work. Nothing else implied." "I don't know you," she said flatly. "No, you don't." He seemed to find this entirely reasonable. "My name is Caleb Ryder. I've been in Garrison 8 years. You can ask anybody on this street if I'm a man of my word." "People lie about other people." "They do," he agreed. "But you came in on the stage alone with one bag and a look like you've been running from something for a while, and Hartwell isn't going to give you a room, and I don't think you have another plan." He said this without any particular judgment, just observation. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to consider your options." She looked at him for a long moment. The gray horse across the street shifted its weight and turned its head toward them as if it had an opinion. In the satchel on her shoulder were 47 pages of ledger records, 2 letters written in a hand she'd recognize anywhere, and a list of names that several powerful men on the eastern seaboard would do considerable violence to recover. She'd been carrying them for 19 days. She hadn't slept properly in 2 weeks. She thought about Horace Whitlock. She thought about how far she'd come, and how it still might not be far enough. She thought about the fact that a remote mountain homestead was, in fact, considerably harder to find than a town hotel. She thought about the way this man had said "nothing else implied" without any particular emphasis, as if it were simply a fact he was stating rather than a promise he was making, and how that was either the most honest thing she'd heard in weeks or the most sophisticated manipulation she'd encountered, and how she genuinely could not afford to bet wrong. She was aware that this was the kind of decision that could not be unmade. She was aware that she was going to say yes. "I'll want my own room with a lock," she said. "Door has a bolt," he said. "Always has." "I'll do my share of the work, cooking, what needs doing, but I'm not a servant." "I'm not looking for one." She looked at him for another moment. "If you try anything, then you hit me with the bag," he said, a flicker of something in those gray eyes that might have been dry humor. "I've already seen it works." She made herself breathe, made herself think past the fear and the exhaustion and the 3 weeks of constant flight, and the weight of what she was carrying, and the fact that she was standing in a strange town on a mountain frontier with no room and no plan, and no one who knew her name. "All right," she said, "I'll accept the offer." He nodded once. No triumph, no visible relief, just the manner of a man who'd asked a reasonable question and gotten a reasonable answer. "I need to pick up supplies at the general goods. Wagon's out back. We'll leave when I'm done." She nodded. She watched him turn and walk back across the street, and she stood there with her satchel, and her exhaustion, and her terrifying collection of evidence, and she thought that she had quite possibly just made the best or worst decision of her life, and she genuinely didn't know which. Caleb Ryder loaded the wagon with the particular efficiency of a man who had done this task many times and was not interested in wasting motion. 2 50-pound sacks of flour, salt, coffee, a crate of tinned goods that he checked against a paper list, lamp oil, a coil of rope, a box of rifle cartridges, .4440, enough to last a serious season. Delilah sat on the wagon bench and watched the town and let herself feel, for the first time in days, something other than raw, ongoing fear. She watched the street with the professional attention of someone who'd learned to assess environments quickly, cataloging exits and faces and the particular rhythms of a place. Garrison was poor and raw and somewhat mean in the way that frontier towns could be. Proud, without quite having enough to be proud of. Suspicious of strangers, in the manner of a place that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted the world to find it. But it was also clearly real. The church was new because someone had recently built it. There were flowers in a window box outside what appeared to be the doctor's office. A young woman came out of the dry goods store with a baby on her hip and spoke for a few minutes with an older man, and they both laughed at something, and Delilah watched that small, ordinary exchange with a longing so sharp it surprised her. She wanted ordinary. She'd been wanting it for years. She'd wanted it before Whitlock, even before he'd stepped into her life and decided that what she had built was his to take. She'd wanted a place and a door with her name on it and work. That was hers, and the simple, uncomplicated right to exist without someone deciding she was an asset to be managed or a problem to be eliminated. She'd been carrying his ledgers for 19 days. 47 pages that proved, in his own careful hand and the hands of his accountants, that Horace Whitlock had spent 11 years defrauding investors, bribing officials, forging land titles, and systematically stealing from widows and orphaned estates. Delilah had not planned to take them. She had not planned any of this. She'd been employed as his private secretary for 2 years. A respectable position, well-paying, the kind of work a capable woman could find in Philadelphia if she was smart enough and lucky enough and careful enough not to ask too many questions. She'd asked too many questions, not out loud, and not to anyone who would report it. But she'd read everything that passed through her desk, because that was her nature, and because the work required it, and she'd been adding things up for months before she understood what she was actually looking at. And when she understood it, when she finally, clearly saw the shape of what Whitlock was doing and who was getting hurt, she'd done the thing she apparently couldn't help doing, which was care. It had cost her a great deal. When she'd finally taken the ledger pages, 3 weeks ago, on a night when Whitlock was in Baltimore and she'd been left to manage the office files, she'd done it quickly and without hesitation, because hesitating would have stopped her. She'd taken the pages she'd already identified as the most damning, the ones that showed the theft most clearly, the ones with names she recognized from newspaper reports about ruined families. She'd taken the 2 letters. She'd left Philadelphia that same night on the first train west. Whitlock would know it was her. There was no one else. And Horace Whitlock was not a man who accepted losses without recovery. She'd been moving since then. Not with a plan, exactly. More with the knowledge that she needed to get somewhere that men with warrants and hired guns couldn't easily reach her, and that she needed to find someone with the authority and the integrity to actually use what she was carrying. She'd thought vaguely about federal marshals. She'd thought about newspapers. She'd thought about a lot of things in 19 days of trains and stages and hard-benched waiting rooms in towns whose names she'd already forgotten. What she hadn't thought, even once, was that she might find a stranger worth trusting. Caleb came out of the general goods with the last items and loaded them into the wagon bed with the same unhurried economy, then came around and climbed up to the bench beside her without ceremony. He picked up the reins. Then he stopped and looked at her. "Anything you need before we go?" She almost said no out of reflex. Then she thought about the 3-day ride she'd just been on and said, 5 minutes, and climbed down and went into the general goods herself. She came back with a small package wrapped in brown paper, dried beef, a block of hard cheese, 2 apples, and she handed half of it to him without explanation and climbed back onto the bench. He looked at the food, then at her, and then he clucked to the horses and pointed them north toward the mountains. They ate as they rode. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. The road, if it could be called that, headed upward almost immediately, following the curve of a valley that narrowed as the mountains closed in on either side. The gray sky had dropped lower, and there was cold in the air that wasn't just altitude, it smelled like snow. "How far?" Delilah asked. 4 hours more or less. Trail's rough in 2 places where the runoff crossed it last month. He glanced at the sky. "We'll make it before dark if we don't stop." She nodded. She ate her apple in silence, watching the town of Garrison drop away behind them as the trail wound upward into the pines. "I'm not in trouble with the law," she said after a while. He kept his eyes on the trail. Didn't ask. "I know you didn't. I'm telling you anyway." She paused. "I'm in trouble with a man. A powerful one. He'll likely send people looking for me, and they might come as far as Wyoming." He was quiet for a moment, working through this. "Might come as far as Garrison?" "Maybe, eventually." She watched his profile. "I wanted you to know before we got far enough that it complicated things." I was quiet a beat longer, and she couldn't quite read what was happening in that weathered face. Then he said, "Are you carrying anything I should know about?" "Documents," she said carefully. "Nothing illegal. Evidence of crimes? His, not mine." "What kind of crimes?" She thought about how to compress 11 years of systematic fraud into a form that was honest without being overwhelming. "He stole from people who couldn't fight back," she said finally, "and then he made sure they couldn't prove it." Caleb absorbed this. They went around a bend in the trail where a rockfall had narrowed it to barely wagon width, and he steered the horses through with the absent automatic competence of someone who had done it 100 times. "What's his name?" Caleb asked. "Horace Whitlock." No recognition in his face. That wasn't surprising. Philadelphia might as well have been another country up here. "You know where you are?" "He knows I came west. He doesn't know where yet." She looked at the trees closing in around the trail. "He'll find out eventually. Men like him usually do." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The horses worked steadily upward, their breath beginning to show in the cold air. "All right," he said. She waited for more. There wasn't any. "All right," she repeated. "That's all you have to say?" He glanced at her briefly, something in the corner of his expression that wasn't quite amusement but was in the same neighborhood. "What would you like me to say?" "I've just told you that I'm bringing potential danger onto your mountain." "You told me a man might send people looking for you," he said. "That's not the same thing as certain danger. And the mountain's large." He looked back at the trail. "If and when it becomes a problem, we'll deal with it." Delilah sat with that for a moment. The straightforwardness of it, the matter-of-fact was strange and somehow harder to bear than hostility would have been. Hostility she knew what to do with. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "You have no reason to take my side against anyone." "Maybe not." He was quiet for a moment. "You stood there in the middle of that street today, and you didn't flinch. A lot of people would have. A lot of people would have looked for someone to hide behind before they ever reached for that bag." He paused. "I've got some respect for people who stand their ground. Not much more complicated than that." She didn't know what to do with that either, so she looked at the trail ahead and ate the last of the dried beef, and said nothing. The mountains closed in around them, gray and enormous and old, and Garrison fell entirely out of sight behind the first ridge, and the only sounds were the horses and the wind through the pines and the distant, high complaint of some bird Delilah didn't know the name of. The homestead appeared through the trees in the last gray light of the afternoon, and Delilah's first thought was that it was smaller than she'd imagined, and her second was that it was more solid. The cabin was heavy timber, low and unpretentious, with a stone chimney and a roof that had been recently patched with fresh-cut shingles. There was a barn behind it, and a smaller outbuilding that might have been a smokehouse or a tool shed, and a split-rail fence running along one side of a pasture where 3 horses stood looking at the arriving wagon with mild professional interest. There was a dog. It came around the corner of the barn at speed, a large, rough-coated animal that was mostly gray with some brown above the eyes, and it barked twice at the wagon before recognizing Caleb and shifting immediately into the frantic physical happiness of a dog greeting someone it genuinely cares about. "That's Hatch," Caleb said, setting the brake and climbing down. The dog hit him at waist height, and he caught it by the ruff with both hands and scruffed its ears. And for a moment, the weathered restraint that characterized everything about Caleb Ryder dissolved entirely, and he was just a man greeting a dog he was glad to see. Down, down, settle. Hatch settled, sat, looked at Delilah with intense amber eyes. She climbed down from the wagon and held out her hand. The dog sniffed it carefully, then, apparently satisfied, shoved its large head against her palm with some force. He likes you, Caleb said, which she chose to interpret as a good sign. The inside of the cabin was plain and clean, in the way of a space kept organized by habit rather than aesthetics. A main room with a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, shelves on one wall holding a practical library of 24 books, tins, tools, and what appeared to be a coffee grinder. A kitchen area at the back. 2 doors off the main room. He opened the one on the right and showed her a room barely large enough for the bed and the small chest it contained, with a single window looking out toward the mountain and a door with a solid iron bolt exactly where he'd said it would be. Sheets are clean, he said. Wood's in the box by the hearth. I'll get the supplies off the wagon. She put the satchel on the chest, on top, where she could see it, where she'd been putting it every night for 19 days, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she let herself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, all of the exhaustion and fear and relief and residual adrenaline that she'd been suppressing since she stepped off the stage. Then she stood up, took off her coat, and went to help with the supplies. Dinner was simple. A stew that Caleb put together with the efficiency of a man who cooked because he had to, rather than because he enjoyed it, beans and salt beef and dried onion, with bread from a loaf he'd bought in town. He made coffee without asking if she wanted any, which she took as evidence of reasonable judgment. They ate mostly in silence, but it was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people in close quarters who hadn't figured each other out yet, and were both intelligent enough not to force it. Hatch lay under the table and monitored the meal with focused attention. After a while, Caleb said, "There's a second rifle in the cabinet there, the Henry. You know how to use a rifle?" She looked at him. "I know which end to point at the problem." The corner of his mouth moved. "We'll work on it. A woman alone on this mountain should be able to shoot. That's just practical." "I'm not opposed to practical," she said. He refilled the coffee and sat back down. He looked at his cup for a moment. "You said you worked for this man, Whitlock, for 2 years, as a secretary." She watched his face for whatever reaction most men had to that, and found instead just attention, the look of someone gathering information. "He's in real estate and banking, Philadelphia. Well-connected, state officials, a judge, a partner in 3 law firms. The fraud goes back at least 11 years. And you have documents that prove it, 47 pages of ledger records and 2 original letters." She looked at the table. "Enough, if they reach the right people. More than enough." "What stopped you from going to the authorities in Philadelphia?" She made herself not laugh, though it was a sharp and humorless impulse. "The judge on the county circuit court took $40,000 in exchange for burying 3 separate complaints from defrauded investors. The city marshal's office has 2 officers on Whitlock's payroll. I was going to go to the federal office until I found out his primary attorney was the brother-in-law of the man who runs it." Caleb's face was very still. "Thorough. He's been building that kind of safety for a decade. He doesn't do anything carelessly." She put down her coffee. "He didn't count on me, though. That's the only advantage I have." "Why not? You worked for him 2 years." She considered the question honestly. "Because he looked at me and saw what men like him always see. A capable woman who needed the work. Someone smart enough to be useful, but not, he assumed, smart enough to understand what she was actually looking at." She paused. "And because, and this is the part I think he truly didn't anticipate, I actually cared about the people he was hurting. He didn't think that was a real thing." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a slow, habitual movement. "Where were you planning to take the documents?" "I've been trying to reach a specific federal circuit judge, a man named Albright, who sits in Denver. He's been trying to build a case against Whitlock for 2 years, apparently, but he lacks the original source material." She looked at the cabin wall. "I wrote to him from Kansas City. He knows I'm coming. He doesn't know I'm stuck in Wyoming. Denver's 3 days from here," Caleb said. 4, in spring." "I know." She looked at him directly. "I didn't plan this as a final destination. I planned it as somewhere to stop running for long enough to think. He accepted this. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said quietly, "The people he stole from." "What kind of people?" Delilah thought about the names she'd memorized from the ledger pages, the ones she'd been carrying in her head like stones. Widows, mostly. Women who'd inherited property from their husbands, farms, some city lots, parcels along 3 different railway expansion routes. Whitlock would buy the adjoining property and then manufacture a title dispute. He had lawyers who could produce fraudulent deeds that looked convincing enough to force a settlement, and judges who'd rule in his favor when it went to court. The women usually took what settlement he offered because they had no money to fight and nowhere else to turn. She paused. He did it to at least 30 families that I can identify from the records, probably more. The fire in the hearth snapped and settled. Hatch's tail moved once against the floor. Caleb sat with that for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank the last of it and said, "You'll want to write to Judge Albright again. Let him know your location. I can take it to town when I go in next week." She blinked. The matter-of-factness of it. No drama, no speech about justice, just the practical logistics of the next step. "Yes," she said after a moment. "That would help." "All right." He stood up, collected the bowls, and took them to the wash basin. "It's cold at altitude tonight. There's an extra blanket in the chest in your room." Delilah sat for a moment at the empty table. Outside the cabin window, the first snow of the night had begun to fall. Not heavy, just a few flakes drifting past the glass in the firelight. The mountains out there were enormous and dark and entirely indifferent to the affairs of human beings, which she found, strangely, something of a comfort. She picked up her satchel from the floor beside her chair, where it had been resting against her ankle throughout the meal, where it had been resting against some part of her body for 19 days, and she stood up and said goodnight and went to her room. She bolted the door. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and held the satchel in her lap and breathed. She had not, in 19 days, allowed herself to fully understand how close to the edge she'd been running. She'd kept herself moving because moving was the only thing that felt like control. But now she was still, and the room was quiet, and outside there was snow and mountains and an animal making some low sound she didn't recognize. And somewhere 3,000 miles east of here was Horace Whitlock, who by now had certainly noticed the missing pages and the missing woman, and was doing what men with money and power and fury always do when they've been challenged. Howe was coming, not today, maybe not for weeks. But he was coming because men like him did not allow themselves to be made fools of, and because what she carried was capable of destroying everything he'd built, and because the gap between she got away and she's gone forever was exactly the kind of challenge that Horace Whitlock had been proving his whole life he was capable of closing. Delilah Mercer pressed her hand flat against the satchel leather, and she looked at the dark window and she thought, not yet, she had time. She had a roof and a bolt on the door, and 47 pages, and a strange, quiet man in the next room who'd said we'll deal with it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She didn't know if that was going to be enough. She thought it might be. She lay down on the bed, still dressed, with the satchel tucked against her side, and for the first time in 19 days she was asleep before she'd finished her next thought. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe. Delilah lay still for a moment, the gray morning light, orienting herself the way she'd learned to do over the past 3 weeks, cataloging the sounds, the smell of the room, the quality of the light, before she opened her eyes fully. Old cabin timber, wood smoke, the distant rhythmic thunk of splitting wood from somewhere outside. She was still dressed. The satchel was where she'd left it, pressed against her side, the leather warm from sleep. She sat up and looked at the window. Snow had fallen in the night, maybe 2 inches on the sill, already beginning to melt at the edges in the pale morning sun. The mountains beyond were white-capped and enormous and entirely still. She was alive. She was inside. No one had knocked on the door in the night. She let herself breathe for exactly 3 seconds, then swung her legs off the bed and started the day. Caleb was out behind the cabin when she came around the corner, splitting wood on a large flat-topped stump with the kind of automatic, unhurried efficiency that comes from having done a task 10,000 times. He worked without a coat, despite the cold, his breath coming in regular clouds. And he didn't stop when he heard her approach, just glanced up once, registered that it was her, and kept swinging. Hatch was lying 5 feet away, watching the log pile with grave attention, as though keeping inventory. "Coffee's on the stove," Caleb said. "I saw." She looked at the stack of split wood, which was already substantial. How long have you been out here? Since before light. She stood there a moment, watching him work. There was something clarifying about watching someone do physical labor that well. No wasted movement, no performance, just the job and the tool and the result. Is there a second axe? He paused mid-swing and looked at her. Not the look of a man who was surprised a woman might ask, more the look of a man adjusting a calculation he'd been running. He pointed with the axe handle toward the shed. Smaller one, against the right wall. She found it and came back and found a second stump, and they worked side by side in the cold morning for the better part of an hour without talking much. Her form was not as clean as his, she hadn't done this kind of work in years, and her first few swings glanced off the round rather than splitting it, which was embarrassing, but she adjusted and found the angle, and after a while it started to come more naturally. At some point, Caleb said, without looking over, "Move your left hand higher on the handle. You're losing control at the bottom of the swing." She adjusted. The next log split clean. "Better," he said. It wasn't praise exactly, it was more like confirmation, the kind of correction that assumes competence rather than doubting it. She found she appreciated it considerably more than if he'd made a thing of it. The letter to Judge Albright took her most of that evening, not because she struggled to find words. She'd always been able to write clearly and quickly, it was part of what had made her good at her job, but because getting the tone right mattered. She needed to sound credible without sounding desperate, informative without giving so much detail in a letter that could be intercepted that she compromised the evidence itself. She needed him to believe she was who she said she was, and that what she carried was what she said it was, without being able to show him any of it yet. She wrote 3 drafts at the cabin table while Caleb cleaned the rifle and Hatch snored under the bench. She kept her handwriting small and precise, the way she'd been trained. "I am writing from a safe location in Wyoming territory." She paused, crossed that out. Too vague. It sounded evasive rather than careful. She tried again. "I am currently residing at a private homestead in the mountains north of Garrison, Wyoming territory, and I expect to remain here for the next several weeks while I determine the safest means of transmitting what I carry to your office." "Better." She kept going. At one point, Caleb looked up from what he was doing and said, without particular emphasis, "You write like someone who's used to their words being read carefully." "I was a secretary for 7 years," she said. "First for a shipping firm, then for Whitlock. You learn to write for precision." He considered this. "The documents? Are they in your handwriting?" "Some. The ledger entries are in the handwriting of his accounting staff, 3 different hands. The letters are in Whitlock's own hand." She looked at the page in front of her. "My value to Judge Albright is partly the documents and partly the testimony. I can identify every signature. I can explain the accounting system. I know what the codes in the margin mean, and I know when entries were made versus when they were dated." She paused. "I was in that office for 2 years. I know more about how he operates than most of his own people do, because they didn't read everything. Because most of them knew better than to." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He set down the cleaning cloth and looked at her. "You understood what you were doing when you took those pages." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes." "You knew what it would cost you." "I knew what it would cost me to walk away from them," she said carefully. "That seemed worse." He held her gaze for a moment, something working behind those gray eyes that she couldn't entirely decode, and then he nodded once and picked up the cloth again. She finished the letter. She folded it twice, tight and precise, and wrote Albright's court address on the outer fold in her smallest hand. Caleb rode to Garrison 4 days later, and when he came back he had supplies and news that arrived in roughly equal measure, neither one welcome. He came through the door in the late afternoon and set the saddlebags on the table and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not alarmed, but focused in a new and particular way, the look of a man who has learned something and is in the process of deciding how to say it. "There was a man in town," he said. "Came in 2 days before I got there, according to Walt at the feed store. Easterner. Expensive clothes, hired a horse from the livery, asked questions at the hotel." Delilah's hands had stopped moving on the onion she'd been cutting. "What kind of questions?" "The kind you ask when you're looking for a woman who came in on the stage." He pulled off his jacket and hung it. "Hartwell told him nobody by your description had been through, which is true, technically. You never got a room." "Did anyone connect me to you?" "Not that I could find." He poured himself a cup of the coffee she'd kept hot on the stove. But he's still in town. Asked about the roads north, the mountain roads specifically. The kitchen went quiet. The fire in the stove ticked softly. How much time do you think we have? She asked. If he's just a scout, someone Whitlock sent to find out where you landed, maybe a week before word gets back east and someone with more purpose comes riding. He sat down. If he's here to handle it himself, less. Delilah looked at the half-cut onion on the board. She thought about 19 days of running and the brief reprieve of this place and the letter that was presumably making its way toward Denver right now. And she thought about the particular timing that life seemed to have for delivering the worst news at the precise moment you'd allowed yourself to relax. We need to talk about what happens if they come here, she said. Yes, he said. We do. She put down the knife and turned to face him properly. I'm not going to run again. I want to be clear about that. I'm done running. She looked at him steadily. If Whitlock's people come to this mountain, I intend to be here when they arrive. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. She didn't think she could easily surprise this man, but something that might have been a recalibration. All right, he said. Then we need to be ready. What does ready look like up here? He set down the coffee and leaned back in the chair and looked at the middle distance in the way of someone running through a landscape in their head. The trail from Garrison is the only practical road to this property. There's a second way in over the North Ridge, but it's a full-day climb and you can't bring horses that way in the spring. Anyone coming for you is coming up that trail. He paused. It narrows at 2 points. One just past the creek crossing at the bottom. Maybe 30 yards of single-file passage between the rock walls. The second is about a mile below the cabin, where the old overhang is. What's the overhang? Limestone formation, part of the ridgeline above the trail. It's been unstable since I've been here, frost heave mostly. Every spring it's a little worse. He looked at her. I've been meaning to deal with it, never quite got around to it. She understood what he wasn't saying. She looked at him for a moment, making sure she'd understood correctly. You're saying if someone with enough experience and the right materials got up there before company arrived. I'm saying that a man who knows that ridge well enough could, in theory, have a significant effect on whether that trail stays passable. He held her gaze. It would take time to set up properly, and it's not something you do lightly. No, she agreed. It isn't. The fire ticked. Hatch shifted in his sleep. Tell me what you need, she said. The next 2 weeks were unlike anything in Delilah's experience, before or since. She had lived for years in cities, in rooms and offices, and the kind of indoor domesticity that was everything a woman of her background and means was supposed to want. She'd been competent, she'd been well-organized and precise, and good at navigating the intricate social architecture of professional Philadelphia. She had been, by every measure she'd been taught, a successful woman. None of that had prepared her for this. Caleb began teaching her the morning after his return from Garrison, starting with the rifle. They went out to a flat section of hillside behind the cabin, away from the horses, and he handed her the Henry and stood beside her and corrected her grip in 3 places without ceremony. You're holding it like it's going to bite you, he said. It might. Not if you hold it right. He moved her left hand back 6 inches along the forestock. Keep it snug into the shoulder. The recoil goes there. If you hold it loose, it goes into your face instead. She fired. The shot was wide of the tin he'd set on a fence post 30 yards out, but it was close, and the recoil hit her shoulder rather than her chin, and she understood immediately what the difference in control felt like. Again, he said. She fired again, closer. The problem is you're anticipating the shot, he said. You're flinching before you pull the trigger. Don't think about the noise. Think about the target. She thought about the target. She thought about the thing the target represented. The fact that men were likely coming for her and the documents she carried, and she needed to be able to do something about that beyond swing a heavy satchel. She pulled the trigger. The tin flew off the post. There was a silence. Then Caleb said, "There you go." It wasn't congratulations. It was just observation, the same way he'd said better with the axe. She found she'd started watching for those small calibrations, the almost approvals that cost him nothing to deliver, and somehow meant considerably more than effusive praise would have. Over the following days, he taught her to track trail conditions, to read the mountain weather by the shape of the clouds above the western ridge, to check fence line for the kind of damage that meant something larger than a deer had been testing it. He taught her which plants were edible along the creek bank and which were not, and he taught her that one by picking a leaf off the wrong plant and making her smell it before explaining what it would do to her liver, which she found both educational and vaguely alarming. She was not a natural rancher. She was not graceful on horseback. She could ride, adequately, but the mountain trails were different from the city parks she'd ridden in as a girl, and the horse Caleb assigned her, a short coupled bay mare named Agnes, had strong opinions about her footing that Delilah had to negotiate rather than command. She made mistakes. She dropped a full pail of water twice in the first week, and once got her boot solidly stuck in the mud near the creek and had to be retrieved by Caleb, who was professional enough not to laugh, though the quality of the silence that followed suggested he was exercising some restraint. "You're thinking too much," he told her after the boot incident while she poured creek water out of her footwear. "I'm trying to get it right." "You're trying to get it right before you've gotten it wrong enough to understand it." He handed her the boot back. "Some things you have to do wrong first." She looked at him. Is that frontier wisdom or just personal experience? He seemed to actually consider the question. Both, probably. She put the wet boot back on and stood up, and they kept walking. The evenings were different from the days. The days were work, clear, physical, purposeful, the kind of labor that left her genuinely tired in a way she hadn't felt in years, and which she was starting to understand was not entirely unpleasant. But the evenings, when the work was done and the fire was built up and the coffee was on, had a different texture. They talked, not continuously. There were long stretches of comfortable silence that she'd never experienced with anyone before and found herself reluctant to fill, but in the fragmentary, honest way of two people who are slowly becoming real to each other. He told her about the homestead. He'd come to Wyoming 8 years ago from a cattle operation in Colorado that had gone under in a bad winter, lost most of the herd, and a partner he'd trusted more than he should have. He'd spent the money he had left buying the land here and had been building it up since, mostly alone, because alone was simpler than the alternatives he'd tried and found wanting. "What happened to the partner?" she asked, one night when the fire was low. I was quiet for a moment. "He took what was left of the operating cash and went east." His tone was flat, without much color. "That was the last I saw of him." "Were you friends?" "I thought so." He looked at the fire. "I was wrong about what that meant." She understood the particular quality of that kind of disappointment, the kind that doesn't announce itself as grief, but sits in the chest for years as a permanent change in the way you assess trust. "How long ago?" 7 years. "And you've been up here alone since?" "I get to town," he said, a little dryly. "That's not the same thing." He looked at her sideways, something in his expression that was careful and slightly wry. "No," he said, "it isn't." She told him things too, in pieces, and over evenings, more than she'd intended, which surprised her. She told him about her family in Baltimore, her father who'd been a clerk and had died when she was 17 and left her mother and 2 younger brothers with nothing, and how she'd gone to work as a typist at 15 to keep them and had been doing some version of that ever since. She told him about the shipping firm and the 7 years she'd spent learning how businesses worked from the inside out, reading contracts and correspondence and balance sheets until she understood them as well as any attorney. "That's why Whitlock hired you," Caleb said. "That's why he hired me. And that's why he thought he understood me." She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. "He hired me because I was good at the work, and because he thought I needed the position badly enough that I'd never ask dangerous questions." "But you did." "I didn't ask questions," she said. "I just kept reading." One night she came out of her room to get water and found him sitting at the table with a letter in his hand, and she recognized from the fold in the handwriting that it was not a letter she'd written. His expression, when he looked up, was careful in a way that meant something. "It's from Garrison," he said. "Walt sent a writer up." He set it on the table. "The man who was asking about you. He's not alone anymore. 3 men arrived on the stage yesterday. They've been asking about the North Road." Delilah sat down across from him. She was very still. "How many total?" Walt counted 4. Might be more he didn't see. "One of them. Is one of them larger? Well-dressed, gray at the temples. Moves like a man who expects the room to arrange itself around him?" Caleb looked at her carefully. "Walt didn't describe them well, just said they were armed and not ranchers." She thought about that description, armed and not ranchers. She thought about what 4 men from Horace Whitlock meant. Not ordinary hired hands, not simple debt collectors. Whitlock used lawyers for collection and bought law enforcement for legitimate suppression. When he sent men who carried guns and weren't pretending to be something else, it meant he'd given up on getting the documents back quietly and shifted to a different kind of solution. She looked at the table. She looked at her own hands, which were steadier than she thought they should be. He's not coming to negotiate, she said. No, Caleb said. I don't think he is. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals, and the cabin was very quiet around them. And somewhere outside on the mountain an owl was asking its single patient question into the dark. The overhang, she said. I've been looking at it. He stood up and went to the shelf and came back with a piece of paper, a rough map, hand-drawn, showing the trail and the ridge above it and the two narrow points he'd described. He spread it on the table. The loose section is here, about 40 feet wide, limestone shelf. If the right pressure was applied at the right point, not just one location, you'd need 3, maybe 4, the whole section would let go. What kind of pressure? Dynamite, he said. I've got a small store. Mining supply from 2 years ago when I was cutting the drainage channels. He looked at the map. It would take time to place correctly, and it can only go one way. Once the shelf comes down, the trail below is impassable for a long time. How long to set it up? If I started tomorrow, 2 days, maybe 3. She looked at the map. At the narrow trail below the limestone shelf and the way the canyon walls pressed in on either side. She thought about the alternative, which was running again, and she felt the absolute refusal of that settle into her bones like cold. 3 days is enough, she said. They'll spend at least that much time in garrison asking questions and figuring out how to get horses up the trail. She looked at him. Do we do this? He met her eyes across the table, and the question between them was larger than the tactical one, larger than dynamite and trail access, and the approaching problem of 4 armed men. It was the question of whether they were in this together, properly and completely, and without reservation, which was a different thing from a stranger offering a room to a woman who had nowhere else to go. Caleb Ryder looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and folded the map and stood up. I'll start at first light, he said. She didn't sleep well that night, not from fear, exactly. The fear had become such a constant that it had changed texture, become more like a permanent condition than an acute sensation. She lay in the dark and thought about the people whose names were in the ledger pages in her satchel. She thought about Margaret Holt, 63 years old, whose 40-acre farm outside of Lancaster had been taken through a forged deed dispute in 1871 while her son was dying of fever. She thought about Alice Reardon, who'd been 31 when Whitlock's lawyers manufactured a title conflict over the 3 city lots her husband had left her, and who'd spent the following 5 years cleaning houses for other people. She thought about the 11 others she could name by heart, and the ones she couldn't name but had seen in the columns of the ledger. Amounts transferred, amounts paid to lawyers, amounts that represented entire lives dismantled and absorbed. She was doing this for them. She needed to remember that when the fear got loud. She got up before dawn and built up the fire and made coffee, and was standing at the cabin window with a cup in her hand when Caleb came through the main room already dressed, already carrying the coil of fuse wire she'd seen in the storage shed. He stopped when he saw her. You're up early. Couldn't sleep. He looked at her for a moment. You don't have to be involved in setting the charges. That's my work. I'm not going to sit here and wait, she said. Tell me what to do. He considered her for what felt like a longer moment than necessary. Then he said, There's a second coil of wire in the shed. Bring it. She went and got the wire. They left the cabin as the first gray light was beginning to define the ridgeline above them, Hatch padding ahead on the trail like a scout, the cold air carrying the smell of pine and snowmelt, and the particular thin clarity of mountain mornings. The limestone shelf was 40 minutes above the cabin, and from below it looked just as unstable as Caleb had described. A broad overhang of pale rock that jutted out over the trail, shot through with the vertical cracks of frost heave and the wider fractures of sheer geological impatience. Caleb studied it for a while without speaking, his eyes moving across the face of it in a slow, technical survey. Then he said, There, and there, pointing to 3 locations she could see held natural fracture lines running close to the surface. I need to set charges at each point simultaneously. Single fuse won't do it. The timing has to be close enough that the whole section moves at once. What do you need me to do? He looked at her. Can you handle heights? She looked at the rock face, then at him. Define handle. He almost smiled. Reasonably not panic. I can manage reasonably not panic, she said. Then I need someone on that ledge above the middle fracture while I work the lower 2, he said. It's accessible from the east side, but There's a goat trail up the back. I'll show you exactly where to place it and how deep. She looked at the ledge. She looked at the drop below the trail. She thought about Margaret Holt's 40 acres and Alice Reardon's city lots. Show me, she said. He showed her. They worked through the morning in the cold and the growing light, and Delilah Mercer spent 40 minutes on a limestone ledge 40 feet above a mountain trail, learning how to pack explosive charges into rock fractures while a man she'd known for less than 3 weeks talked her through it from below with the same patient, technical calm with which he'd taught her to hold a rifle. Her hands shook slightly for the first 5 minutes. Then they stopped. By noon the charges were set. By mid-afternoon they were back at the cabin, the fuse lines run down to a sheltered position in the tree line below the overhang where a person could touch them off and be far enough from the blast to remain standing. Caleb made coffee, and they sat at the table, and he said, "It's done. All we need now is the right moment." Delilah looked at her hands, dusty, slightly scraped from the rock face, entirely her own. "How will we know when that is?" "When they're on the trail below the shelf," he said. "Not before, not after." She nodded. Outside, the mountains were going golden in the late afternoon light, and the sky was the particular deep blue of high altitude in spring, and somewhere on the road from Garrison, 4 armed men were preparing to come up toward them with instructions she didn't need to guess at. She picked up her coffee and looked at the window, and was surprised to find that the fear she'd been carrying for 19 days had changed into something else. Not absence of fear exactly, but something harder and more purposeful that occupied the same space. She was tired of being the one who ran. That was over now. The waiting was the worst of it. Delilah had expected action to be the hard part. The preparation, the placement of charges, the proximity to the kind of violence she'd spent her whole life trying to stay away from. But the preparation had given her something to do with her hands and her mind. And it turned out that doing something, even something frightening, was considerably easier than sitting still and waiting for the thing you feared to arrive at a time of its own choosing. They waited 2 days. The first day passed in the particular suspended quality of people who have done everything they can do and must now simply let events move at their own pace. Caleb checked the fence line in the upper pasture. Delilah baked bread. Not because she felt like baking, but because the physical routine of it gave her hands something to do, and because the cabin smelled better for it, which felt like a small reclamation of ordinary life in the middle of something that was not ordinary at all. She cleaned the rifle twice. She read 40 pages of a novel she found on Caleb's shelf, something about the sea, and retained almost none of it. That evening, Caleb came in from checking the horses and said, without preamble, "Ryder came up the lower trail about 2 hours ago, turned back when he saw the cabin." Delilah set down the book. "Scout." "Yes, they're close." He went to the window and looked out at the dark. "Tomorrow, probably. Or the day after." She looked at the satchel where it sat on the chest in her room. The door opened so she could see it from the table. 47 pages, 2 letters. The accumulated evidence of 11 years of deliberate cruelty, packed into a leather bag that had been pressed against her body for 23 days now. "If something goes wrong," she said. "If something happens to me, don't." She looked at him. He was still at the window, his back to her, but his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not sharp, exactly, but final. Like a door closing on a particular kind of thinking. "I need to say it," she said. He turned from the window. "Then say it. If something happens to me, the letter to Albright explains where the documents are and what they contain. There's a second letter inside the satchel, addressed to him directly, that I wrote the first week I was here. It has enough detail in it that even without my testimony, the ledger pages would be interpretable." She held his gaze. "The satchel goes to Denver if I can't take it myself. That's the only thing that matters." He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was difficult to read in the lamplight, complicated in the way that faces get when a person is working through something they've decided not to say. "Noted," he said finally. "Caleb, I heard you." He picked up his jacket from the hook by the door. "I'm going to check the charges one more time before it gets full dark." She watched him go. She sat at the table in the lamplight and listened to the mountain quiet outside and thought about the difference between being heard and being agreed with, and decided that for now, it was enough. They came on the second morning. Hatch heard them first. The dog had been lying near the door in his usual posture of sleepy authority when he raised his head at something below the range of human hearing, his ears forward, his body suddenly still in the way of animals that have not entirely forgotten what they were before they were domesticated. Delilah was at the stove and she saw it and said nothing, just set down the pan and looked at Caleb across the room. I was already moving. He went to the window that faced down the trail and looked through the gap in the shutter. 5, he said, not 4. She crossed the room and looked. The trail below the cabin was still in morning shadow, the pines close on either side, and she had to look for a moment before she picked them out. 5 riders moving up through the trees in a loose formation, not hurrying, but not casual either. The kind of movement that was purposeful without being rushed. The movement of men who knew where they were going and were confident about what they'd find there. She could see him from 200 yards. Horace Whitlock was in the center of the group on a dark horse, wearing a coat that was wrong for the mountains, too fine, too city, and a hat that he'd spent real money on. He was 61 years old and built like a man who'd been powerful in his youth and had kept most of it, thick through the chest and straight-backed in the saddle. Even at this distance, at this hour, he had the particular presence of a man who had spent 60 years being the most important person in any room he entered and had come to regard that as simply a fact of nature. Beside him was a man she recognized. Collins, not his first name, just Collins, the way that certain men are only ever known by their last name. He'd been with Whitlock for years, doing work that didn't have a clean title. The other 3 were hired. One of them, she noticed, wore a badge. He brought a lawman, she said. Caleb looked. Territorial badge. I don't recognize him. His voice was steady, that same flat functional calm he carried into everything. Probably not legitimate. No, she said. He bought one. He buys everything. She stepped back from the window. They're still below the shelf? Just coming up to it now. He looked at her. We need to move. The plan was simple in the way that plans worked out under pressure tend to be. Most of the complexity stripped away until only the essential remained. Caleb would get to the detonation point in the tree line before the riders cleared the shelf. Delilah would take a position above and east of the cabin, behind the large granite outcrop that gave a clear line of sight to the cabin approach, with the Henry and enough ammunition to matter. If the charges worked, the conversation would end before it properly began. If they didn't, if the shelf held, if the timing was wrong, if any of the things that could go wrong went wrong, then they would deal with that from cover and try to hold until the riders realized the position wasn't worth what it would cost. It wasn't a perfect plan. Delilah was acutely aware of that. 5 armed men against 2 people and a dog, one of whom had been shooting a rifle for less than 3 weeks. The charges might not all detonate. The shelf might take more than one try to bring down. The man with the badge was a variable she didn't like. A corrupt lawman was still a lawman in the eyes of some people, and the presence of one changed the story of whatever happened here in ways she couldn't entirely predict. But she was done running. She'd said that to herself 2 days ago, and she meant it now with the particular clarity of a person who has finally stopped negotiating with the fear they've been carrying too long. Go, she said. Caleb went. She took the rifle and the extra ammunition, and she went out the back of the cabin and up the slope toward the granite outcrop, moving fast and low through the trees, Hatch shadowing her without being asked. She found her position, a notch in the rock face that gave her cover and a clear angle on the trail where it emerged from the trees below the cabin, and she settled into it and checked the rifle and looked down the slope and breathed. The mountain was very quiet. The morning light was coming in long and low from the east, turning the snow on the upper ridgeline gold. She could see the trail through the trees below. She could see the riders moving up through the last of the pines toward the open ground below the limestone shelf. She thought, now, Caleb. He didn't fire immediately. She understood why. Intellectually. The timing had to be precise. The riders had to be fully committed to the passage below the shelf, not scattered at the entry point where some might be clear of the fall zone. But the waiting in her position above the cabin, watching 5 armed men move steadily toward her, was a different kind of waiting than the past 2 days had been. This was the waiting that happened when the thing you'd been preparing for had finally arrived and was moving toward you at a pace that couldn't be stopped. Whitlock was speaking to the man beside him. She couldn't hear the words from this distance, but she could see the gesture, the impatient forward motion of a hand that was accustomed to pointing at things and having them happen. Collins nodded. They moved under the shelf. The sound was everything. She'd expected an explosion, a sharp crack, the kind of concussive bang that announced itself cleanly. What she got instead was something larger and less defined. Three near simultaneous detonations that merged into a single enormous sound that she felt in her chest and her teeth before she heard it with her ears, followed immediately by something even louder. The grinding, accelerating roar of several thousand tons of limestone shelf, separating from the mountain that had been holding it for longer than anyone alive could remember. The dust cloud came up like smoke, rising above the tree line and then above the ridge line, and the sound went on for what seemed much longer than it should have. The rolling boom of the initial collapse followed by the lower sustained thunder of settling rock. And somewhere inside all of that, for 2 or 3 seconds, she thought she heard the high, distant sound of men and horses. Then it was quiet. Not entirely. There were still small sounds, the tick of settling debris, a few loose rocks still making their way down the slope. But the enormous violence of it was done, and the dust was rising in a column against the morning sky, and when it began to clear she could see that the trail below the shelf was gone. Not blocked, gone, replaced by a ragged new landscape of broken limestone the size of houses, white and raw, where the fractures were fresh, piled 20 feet deep across 100 yards of what had been the only road to this place. She looked for riders. 2 horses were visible above the fall line, running back down the trail the way they'd come, riderless, their reins flying. One man was on the ground at the near edge of the debris field, unmoving. She couldn't see the others. Then she heard the shot. It came from her left, from the tree line at the east edge of the cabin clearing, and she was moving before she'd consciously processed what it meant, dropping below the notch in the granite as a second shot hit the rock face 6 inches above where her head had been. The impact scattered fragments of stone across her shoulders, and one caught her jaw and she felt the sting of it before she understood where it had come from. Someone had come up the back way. She pressed against the granite and worked through it quickly. 2 riders. She hadn't seen them. They must have split off before the others entered the pass, come around the long way via the north approach that Caleb had said was a day's climb for a man on foot. On horses, if they'd left the previous night, they could have made it. She'd underestimated Whitlock's thoroughness. She'd done it once before and learned better. She was angry with herself for doing it again. Another shot hit the rock above her, and she could now place the shooter in the trees, 30 yards east, at roughly her own elevation. A second figure was moving down toward the cabin below her, using the timber for cover, trying to reach the structure before she could. She thought about the satchel inside. She thought about what it meant if someone reached it. She came up fast over the top of the granite notch, and found the man in the trees and fired twice before he could adjust his aim. The first shot was wide, the second was not. The shooter went down hard into the underbrush and did not come back up. The second man was almost at the cabin door. She slid down the backside of the outcrop and ran. She was not graceful about it. She caught her boot on a root halfway down the slope and went sideways, caught herself on one hand and kept moving, and she arrived at the corner of the cabin maybe 4 seconds after the man she was chasing pushed through the door. She went in after him without stopping. He was already at the table, having apparently been told what he was looking for and where it might be. The satchel was on the floor. He'd swept it off the chest in her room, the door open, and he was on his knees going through it when she came through the door. I was younger than she'd expected, 25 maybe. Brown hair, city clothes gone wrong for the mountains. He looked up at her with the rifle in his hands, and his eyes went wide, but his hands were already in the satchel, and what she saw in his face was the particular frozen calculation of a person who isn't sure whether to go for the gun at his hip or keep holding what he has. "Don't," she said. Her voice was steady. The rifle was at her shoulder. She was aware that her hands were shaking, slightly. Not from fear, she thought, but from the adrenaline of the run and the fall and the shot she'd already taken. She breathed once. The shaking stopped. "Put the documents down," she said. "All of them. And put your hands where I can see them." "You won't," he started. "I will," she said. "And I'll be sorry about it for a long time afterward, but that won't help you. Put them down." He put them down. He raised his hands. She crossed the room and picked up the pages from the floor. Several had scattered when he'd upended the satchel, and she gathered them one-handed, keeping the rifle on him, counting. She didn't have time to count properly, but she'd handled these pages enough that she could feel if something was missing, and nothing was. "Get out," she said. He stared at her. "Out? I'm not going to tie you here, and I'm not going to shoot you in my kitchen. Get out. Go back down the mountain the way you came." "There is no way down," he said. "Your man blew the trail." Then walk the long way, she said. You've got legs. He looked at her for another moment, young eyes and a face that wasn't yet hard enough for the work he'd been hired for, and then he got up and went out the door. She stood in the middle of the cabin and breathed. Caleb found her 5 minutes later, outside the cabin door, sitting on the step with the satchel in her lap and the rifle across her knees. He came from the tree line to the west, moving fast, and when he saw her sitting there, his pace slowed and something that had been very focused in his face came apart slightly. He had a cut on his left arm that was bleeding through his sleeve, not badly but visibly. She noticed it when he sat down on the step beside her. Your arm, she said. Rock fragment, he said. From the blast. I was farther back than I thought I needed to be. He looked at his sleeve, then at her face, where the stone fragment had caught her jaw. What happened to you? Rock fragment, she said. From their shot. He looked at the mark on her jaw for a moment. A small cut, already beginning to swell, nothing serious, with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize, too many things in it at once. There were two more, she said. They came up the back, the north approach. His face changed. You handled it. Yes. Both of them? One is in the east tree line, the other I sent down the mountain on foot. He was quiet for a moment, processing this. Whitlock? She looked toward the dust cloud that was still visible above the tree line, slowly dissipating against the morning sky. The shelf came down on the main trail. I couldn't see through the dust clearly, but she stopped, organized what she'd actually seen. 2 horses came back up without riders. 1 man down at the edge of the debris field. The others I couldn't account for. Collins was at the front of the group when they entered the passage, Caleb said. He was quiet for a moment. I watched from the detonation point until the dust was too thick. He paused. I saw a man at the back of the formation turn his horse when the first charge went. He might have made it clear of the fall. Delilah looked at the trail below the cabin, empty and still in the morning light. Which man? Too far to say. She looked at the tree line. She looked at the satchel in her lap. She looked at the long, empty slope below the cabin, at the place where the trail bent into the pines and disappeared. Somewhere down that mountain, buried under tons of limestone or riding hard away from it, was the architecture of 11 years of crimes against ordinary people who'd never done anything to deserve what happened to them. She didn't feel triumphant. She wasn't sure what she felt exactly. Large and strange and tired. Her jaw hurt. Her hand where she'd caught herself in the fall was scraped down to pink skin across the palm. We need to look after your arm, she said. It can wait. It can't, she said. Infection doesn't care about timing. Come inside. He looked at her. Something in his face that he didn't have the words for yet, or maybe had the words for but wasn't ready to say. He stood up and held the door. She went in with the satchel and the rifle, and she set the rifle against the wall, and she put the satchel on the table, and she went to get the medicine kit from the shelf, because there was always something more to do, and doing it was better than sitting with what had just happened until she understood what it meant. She cleaned and bound the wound on his arm in the cabin kitchen, and he sat still for it with the patience of a man accustomed to dealing with injuries without assistance, which was its own kind of information about the life he'd been living up here. The cut was jagged. A stone fragment had opened a 4-inch gash along the outside of the forearm, deep enough to need careful wrapping, but not deep enough for anything more. She cleaned it twice, because once didn't feel like enough. And he didn't say anything about it. When she was tying off the bandage, he said quietly, You shot him. Yes. First time? She kept her hands on what she was doing. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You're all right? She thought about what all right meant in the context of the question. She thought about the man in the east tree line and the 2 shots she'd fired and the second one that hadn't missed. She thought about the way he'd gone down and the sound of it and the fact that she'd kept running before she'd really understood what she'd done. I will be, she said, which was honest. Yes, he said. You will. She finished the bandage and stepped back and looked at him. This man she'd known for less than a month, who had walked into the middle of a street confrontation for reasons she still didn't entirely understand, who had offered her a room and a bolt on the door and said, We'll deal with it as if it were simple, who had helped her set charges in a limestone face 40 feet above a mountain trail and had detonated them this morning without hesitation. Caleb. She stopped. He looked up at her. Thank you, she said. And then, because that felt inadequate for what she actually meant, I don't have a better word for it. I've been trying to find one. He held her gaze for a moment. The morning light was coming through the window now, proper and gold, falling across the table and the satchel, and the two of them standing on either side of what they'd been through together. You don't need a better word, he said. Outside. Hatch barked once at something in the distance, and then went quiet. The mountain was still. Where far below them, dust was settling over limestone and the remains of something that had been coming for her for 23 days. And it was over now in the way that some things are over. Not clean, not without cost, but done. She sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. The satchel was in front of her. Intact. Complete. Still carrying everything it had been carrying when she'd walked off a stage in Garrison and looked at a town that didn't want her and a future she couldn't predict. Still worth everything it had cost. She looked at the window and the mountain beyond it, and she thought about Denver and Judge Albright and the work that was still ahead. She thought about Margaret Holt and Alice Reardon and 11 years of names in the columns of a ledger. She thought about what came next. But that was for later. For now there was a fire to build up and water to heat and a wounded arm to check again in the afternoon, and the slow, essential work of a day that was ordinary in every way, except that they were alive in it. That was enough. That was for now entirely enough. The fever came on the third night. Delilah had been watching for it. The wound on Caleb's arm had looked clean enough when she'd redressed it the afternoon of the collapse. But mountain wounds had a way of turning quietly, and she'd been checking it twice a day with the particular attention of someone who understands that infection doesn't announce itself until it's already well established. The second morning after the fight, she'd found the edges of the wound angrier than she wanted to see, and by the evening of the third day his temperature had climbed enough that she could feel the heat of his skin from 6 inches away. He didn't tell her he felt ill. She found out because she woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of him moving in the main room and came out to find him sitting at the table with his jacket on over his nightclothes, looking at the fire with the unfocused expression of a man whose body is fighting something his mind hasn't caught up with yet. You have a fever, she said. I'm fine. You're sitting at the table at 2 a.m. in your coat. She put her hand on his forehead. His skin was dry and hot. You're not fine. He looked up at her with the expression of a man who is accustomed to being the person who manages situations and finds the reversal of that arrangement genuinely uncomfortable. I've been worse. That's not the reassurance you think it is. She went to get the medicine kit. Get back to bed. Delilah, Caleb. She turned and looked at him directly. Bed. Now. I've been doing everything on this mountain for 3 weeks. I can manage a fever. He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up and went to bed, which she chose to interpret as evidence that he was sicker than he was admitting, rather than any particular deference to her authority. The next 5 days were the hardest she'd spent on the mountain, and she had a substantial inventory of hard days to compare them against. The fever climbed before it broke. 2 days in, it hit a point that frightened her in a way the fight on the trail hadn't. That particular deep fear of helplessness, when the threat is internal and there is no charging position to take, and no fuse to light. She boiled water and changed the dressing 3 times a day and kept the wound as clean as the medicine kit allowed. And she made broth from the salt beef and dried beans and sat beside the bed and made him drink it, which he resisted with the low-grade stubbornness of a sick man who has decided that resistance is the last available form of dignity. I'm not hungry, he said, the second evening. I know, she said. Drink it anyway. It tastes like the inside of a boot. Yes, she agreed. Drink it. He drank it. He lay back against the pillow with his eyes closed, and she thought, not for the first time, that he looked different like this. Not diminished exactly, but exposed in the way that illness exposes people, stripped of the functional composure that was such a constant part of him that she'd stopped noticing it as a choice he was making. She sat beside him through the worst of the second night, when the fever spiked and he talked intermittently in the half-conscious way of people whose internal temperature is making them unreliable narrators of their own experience. He said things she didn't entirely follow, names, fragments of sentences that belonged to conversations she hadn't been part of. At one point he said the name of the partner who'd taken the money and gone east, just the name, said it with a tone that was flat and final, the way you say the name of something that has been resolved. She stayed. She didn't think about why she was staying. She understood the practical reasons clearly enough. The isolation of the homestead, the blocked trail, the fact that there was no one else. But she was honest enough with herself in the quiet of those long nights to know that the practical reasons were not the only ones. On the morning of the fourth day, his temperature broke. She woke from a light sleep in the chair beside his bed to find him watching her with clear eyes, sweated through the bedclothes but coherent, the particular focus of a man who has been somewhere difficult and has come back from it. "You stayed," he said. His voice was rough. "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't sleep much." "I slept some." She stood up and checked his forehead. The fever was gone. Not reduced, but genuinely gone. The skin cool and damp. "How do you feel?" "Like I had a fever for 4 days." "That's honest." She went to get water. "You need to drink. The broth is still on the stove." "Not the boot broth." "Yes, the boot broth." She brought him water and watched him drink and said, "The wound looks better. The red is receding. I think you're through the worst of it." He drank the water and looked at her over the rim of the cup. He had the look of a man who has several things he'd like to say and is uncertain about the order. "How long have I been down?" 4.5 days. "The trail is still blocked. Nobody has come up." She sat back down in the chair. "I've been keeping watch. Hatch has been helping." A brief, genuine amusement crossed his face at that. Then it settled back into something more serious. "You've been managing alone for 4 days." "Yes. The horses, the feed, the—" "Caleb." She looked at him steadily. "I managed." He held her gaze. The morning light was coming through the small window of his room, pale and clear, and outside she could hear the first birds of the day starting their conversation in the pines. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, she thought, but more like the quiet adjustment a person makes when they realize they've been holding an assumption that no longer fits. "Yes," he said, finally, quietly. "I see that." 2 weeks after the collapse, a rider came up the mountain, not from the main trail. That was still impassable, would be for months, maybe longer. He came over the North Ridge the hard way, on a horse that had clearly been pushed, and he arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon looking like a man who'd been riding for 3 days and wasn't sure he'd survive a fourth. He was lean and weathered and somewhere in his 60s, and he wore a gray coat with a Federal Circuit seal on the lapel that Delilah recognized before he'd finished dismounting. He introduced himself as Thomas Briggs, clerk to Judge Howard Albright of the Federal Circuit Court in Denver. He'd been sent, he said, as soon as Albright had received her second letter, the one Caleb had taken to Garrison before the trouble arrived, the one that gave the homestead's location and the nature of what she carried. He'd been told to travel alone and tell no one where he was going, and from the look of him he'd followed both instructions rigorously. "The judge sends his regards," Briggs said, accepting the coffee Delilah put in front of him with the gratitude of a man who had been running on cold creek water for the better part of a day. "And his apologies for the delay in response. Your first letter took 3 weeks to reach Denver, and another week to reach his desk through the usual channels. When your second letter arrived with the location," he stopped, looked at his coffee. "He sent me immediately." "How much does he know?" Delilah asked. "What you've written, the nature of the documents, your employment with Whitlock." Briggs looked up at her. "And the events of the past few weeks, roughly. Word traveled faster than I did, in some respects. There was a report filed with the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne, a complaint about an explosion on a private mountain road. 2 men listed as missing, 1 man recovered with injuries at the base of the mountain, 1 man," he paused, chose his words, "1 man who made it back to Garrison on foot and had quite a lot to say." Delilah looked at Caleb, the young man she'd sent down the mountain. She'd wondered. "What kind of things did he say?" Caleb asked. "Enough that the Territorial Marshal sent a deputy to Garrison to look into it." Briggs wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "The deputy found 2 things of interest. First, that the lawman who'd ridden up with Whitlock's group was carrying a badge from a jurisdiction in Pennsylvania that had no authority in Wyoming territory, and that the warrant he was carrying for your arrest," he looked at Delilah, "was signed by a judge who, it turns out, is currently under federal investigation for accepting bribes." "Judge Carver," Delilah said. Briggs looked at her with the careful attention of a man revising his estimates. "You know about Carver? His name appears twice in the ledger in connection with payments received." She reached across the table and pulled the satchel toward her. She'd had it on the table all afternoon, waiting for this. "Shall I show you?" She opened the satchel and took out the ledger pages, and she laid them on the table in the order she'd organized them, and she walked Thomas Briggs through 47 pages of Horace Whitlock's crimes, the way she'd been rehearsing in her head for 24 days. Methodically, precisely, naming each entry and its significance, identifying the accounting codes and what they represented, connecting the dots between the numbers in the columns and the human beings those numbers had once belonged to. Briggs didn't speak for a long time. He turned pages slowly, read carefully, occasionally asked a question that she answered without hesitation. Caleb sat at the far end of the table and drank his coffee and didn't interrupt. After perhaps an hour, Briggs sat back and looked at the pages spread across the table and said, "Miss Mercer, this is—" He stopped, started again. "Judge Albright has been building toward Whitlock for 2 years. He's had testimony, he's had affidavits, he's had secondary documentation. What he has not had is primary source material that shows the fraud in Whitlock's own accounting system with identifiable names attached to each transaction. Until now," she said, "until now." Briggs looked at her steadily. "You understand what this means in terms of your own situation. The warrant issued by Carver is void by virtue of the investigation into his conduct. That doesn't mean Whitlock won't try other avenues. Whitlock is dead," she said. Briggs paused. "We don't have confirmation. I was at the front of the group entering the passage when the charges detonated," she said. "2 riders came back without him. The man who survived was at the rear of the formation." She looked at the table. "I'm not celebrating it. I'm just telling you what happened." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ledger pages. "Even so, his legal infrastructure will attempt to survive him. His attorneys, his remaining associates. Dismantling what he built will take time." "I know," she said. "That's what these are for." He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has met a great many people in the course of a long career in the law and has not often been surprised by them. "Judge Albright will want your testimony in Denver." "I know that too." "The trail—" He glanced at Caleb. "We can take the North Ridge on horseback," Caleb said. "It's passable now that the snow is off the upper section. Takes a full day. We'll need to get horses down the other side and arrange transport from there." Briggs nodded. He looked back at the documents on the table. "I'll need to take copies tonight. Or may I—" He looked at Delilah. "Would you be willing to let the originals travel to Denver under my custody? I can give you a signed federal receipt." "No," she said. Not harshly, just plainly. "I carry them to Denver myself." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, and the nod had a quality of genuine respect in it. "Of course." They left for Denver 4 days later, after Caleb was well enough to ride the ridge, and after Delilah had spent those 4 days doing something she hadn't done since the first night she'd arrived on this mountain. Writing. Not letters, not evidence summaries. She wrote testimony. Long, detailed, precise. Everything she'd witnessed, everything she'd read, every conversation she'd had in 2 years in Whitlock's offices that bore on the question of what he'd done, and who had helped him, and who had suffered for it. She wrote at the cabin table every morning until the light went, and in the evenings she and Caleb sat by the fire, and she read him sections of it. Not for review, not because she needed his legal opinion, but because she'd spent 24 days carrying this alone, and the act of saying it out loud to someone who listened without judgment was itself a kind of release she hadn't known she needed. He listened. He asked questions occasionally, clarifying, practical questions, the kind that sharpened rather than complicated. He never once suggested she soften anything. One evening she read him the section about Margaret Holt, the 63-year-old woman, the 40-acre farm in Lancaster, the forged deed dispute. When she finished, there was a silence, and she looked up to find him staring at the fire with an expression she recognized now. The particular stillness he got when something had landed in him and he was deciding what to do with it. "How old was the farm?" he said. "She'd been there 31 years. Her husband built the house. And she lost it. For $11,000 in a rigged settlement, when the land was worth 40. She looked at the pages in her hand. "She's 66 now, if she's still alive, living with her daughter in Baltimore." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "That's in the testimony." "All of it," she said. "Every name I have." He looked at her. Good. It wasn't an elaborate thing to say, but the way he said it, the simple, complete conviction of it, was more sustaining than she could easily explain. She looked back at the page and kept reading. Denver was enormous after the mountain. Not actually enormous. It was a frontier city still working out its own proportions. But after weeks of pine forest and limestone sky, and the particular compressed world of a single homestead, the noise and density and horizontal spread of it hit Delilah like a physical thing the moment they rode in. Judge Howard Albright was a small, precise man in his mid-50s with the kind of eyes that had been reading documents for 30 years and could identify a forged date from across a room. He met them in his chambers the morning after they arrived, and he read the ledger pages himself, slowly and completely, while Delilah sat across from him and Caleb waited in the corridor outside. When Albright finished, he set the last page down and looked at her. "How long did you work for him?" "2 years. And in that time—" He stopped. "Organize something. Miss Mercer, I want to be direct with you. What you've brought me is sufficient. The documentation alone is sufficient for indictment of every associate named in these ledgers. Combined with your testimony, we can proceed against his estate, his legal partners, and the officials who facilitated the fraud." He paused. "That includes Judge Carver. That includes 2 officers in the Philadelphia Marshal's office. That includes a state representative in Pennsylvania whose name appears on page 31. She knew the name on page 31. She'd been carrying it in her head for weeks. "I know." "This will be a long process," he said. "Months, probably over a year before the last of the cases is resolved. I'll need you available for testimony." "I'll be available," she said. He looked at her for a moment, that long document-reading assessment. "You understand that there will be people with strong motivation to interfere with this process?" "Yes," she said. "And you're not deterred." She looked at the ledger pages on his desk. At page 31, visible in the stack, with the entry she knew by heart, the entry that showed $11,000 transferred out of an account labeled Holt, Lancaster, and into an account whose code she'd decoded weeks ago. At all the other pages, all the other entries, all the other names. "I came 3,000 miles with these documents," she said. "No." Albright nodded once, the nod of a man who has concluded an assessment and is satisfied with the result. "Then we'll begin." The process of dismantling what Horace Whitlock had built was not fast, and it was not clean, and it was not the kind of resolution that arrived in a single satisfying moment. It was paperwork and depositions, and the slow, grinding work of federal investigators tracing money through accounts and institutions that had been specifically designed to make tracing difficult. It was 3 separate hearings in Denver over 4 months. It was Delilah sitting in a formal chair in a wood-paneled room and speaking precisely and without emotion about things she had witnessed, while attorneys for the estate attempted, in each hearing, to find some inconsistency in her account that they could use to discredit her. They didn't find one. She'd been a professional secretary for 9 years. She knew how to be accurate. Caleb came to Denver with her for the first hearing and stayed for 2 weeks before the ranch required him back. He sat in the corridor outside the hearing room on the first day, and when she came out at the noon recess, she found him there, exactly where she'd left him, reading a newspaper with the focused composure of a man determined not to look like he'd been waiting. "How was it?" he asked. "Fine," she said. And then, more honestly, "Hard, but fine." He folded the newspaper. "You ate breakfast this morning." "What?" "You ate breakfast. Last time you had a hearing, you didn't eat." He looked at her steadily. "That's better." She looked at him. The matter-of-factness of it, that he'd noticed, that he'd filed it, that he'd produced it as a simple observation rather than a compliment or a concern, was so characteristic of him that she almost laughed. "Go back to the mountain, Caleb," she said. "I'll be all right." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes. "I know you will," he said. "That was never the question." She watched him go and stood in the corridor outside the hearing room and breathed. The afternoon session began in 20 minutes. She had 3 more months of this ahead of her. The attorneys for Whitlock's estate were going to try again this afternoon to suggest that her testimony was motivated by personal grievance rather than factual record, which was the argument they'd been building toward since the first session. She knew exactly how to answer it. She'd been knowing how to answer questions for 9 years. She straightened her coat and went back in. By late autumn, the first properties began to change hands. Albright's office sent her a letter in October. She read it at the cabin table, by the lamp, with the first real snow of the season falling outside, and Hatch asleep under the bench, and Caleb across the table reading something she'd have to look at later to identify. The letter said that 3 properties in the Lancaster area had been transferred back to their original owners under a federal restitution order. It listed the names. Margaret Holt was the third name on the list. Delilah read the name twice. She set the letter down on the table and looked at it. Caleb looked up from his book. He read her face, and she'd been on this mountain long enough now that he could read it accurately. He didn't say anything. He just waited. One of them got her farm back, she said. Her voice came out slightly different than she intended. Margaret Holt, in Lancaster. She got her farm back. He looked at her steadily. She's 66 years old, Delilah said. She's been living with her daughter for 3 years, and she got her farm back. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just put his hand over hers, the way you do for someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just put it down. She looked at his hand on hers. She looked at the letter. She looked at the lamp and the window and the snow coming down outside, soft and silent and entirely indifferent to the affairs of people and the things they carried. She didn't cry. She wasn't going to cry. She'd spent 4 months being precise in hearing rooms, and she wasn't going to stop being precise now. But she turned her hand over under his and held it, and she sat like that for a while, reading the names in the letter one more time, all the way to the end. Outside, the mountain received its first winter snow with the same vast indifference it received everything. The fire in the hearth did what fires do. The lamp held its small circle of light against the dark. Delilah Mercer sat at the table with a letter in one hand and a rancher's calloused hand in the other, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the specific, unfamiliar weight of what it meant to have done the thing she'd set out to do. She'd set out to make it count. It was counting. The snow that fell the night Delilah read Margaret Holt's name in Albright's letter did not stop for 3 days. By the time it did, the mountain had changed its character entirely. The trail from Garrison was buried past any practical use. The North Ridge was a solid wall of white, and the homestead existed in the particular sealed-off solitude that high-altitude winters create, a world reduced to the space between the cabin and the barn and the short distance between the two. The horses stood in their stalls and breathed clouds into the cold air. Hatch developed the habit of pressing himself against the cabin door like a draft excluder and had to be stepped over every time either of them went in or out. The firewood pile, which Caleb had spent the better part of October building to a height that had seemed excessive at the time, began to look more accurately sized. They were alone on the mountain for the winter, and there was no pretending otherwise. It was harder than Delilah had expected, and better than she'd feared, and neither of those things surprised her as much as the fact that she couldn't always tell the difference. The hard parts were specific. There were mornings when the cold came through the cabin walls despite the fire, and she woke with her breath visible and her body already tight with the effort of being warm, and she would lie there in the gray early light thinking about Philadelphia, about steam heat and gas lamps, and the particular luxury of a city that had decided to make itself comfortable. She missed hot water that didn't require 30 minutes of work to produce. She missed being able to walk somewhere. She missed, at odd moments, the sound of other people's ordinary lives happening nearby. The neighbor's door, the street below the window, the general low background noise of a city that was always doing something even when she wasn't. She didn't miss the fear. That was the calculation she made on those cold mornings, and it was always the same. The mountain was hard and the city had been warm, and on the mountain she woke up knowing that the day ahead was hers to navigate rather than someone else's to determine. She had not understood, until she didn't have to be afraid anymore, how much of her energy fear had been consuming. It was like taking off a pack you'd carried so long you'd forgotten it was there. The absence of weight was itself a kind of revelation. The better parts were less specific and harder to name. They had to do with routine mostly. The way a day on the mountain had a shape that made sense. Work that was necessary and visible and done. Meals that meant something because they'd been earned. Evenings by the fire that were quiet in a way that felt like rest rather than absence. And Caleb. She was honest with herself about Caleb. She'd been honest with herself about him for a while now, in the careful, provisional way she'd learned to be honest about things that mattered. Not rushing toward a conclusion, not performing an emotion she hadn't fully earned, but not pretending either. He was in her daily life in the way that the fireplace and the rifle and the coffee on the stove were in her daily life, constant and functional, and, she'd realized somewhere in November, genuinely necessary in a way that had stopped being about practical circumstance and become something else. I was not easy. She wanted to be accurate about that too. He was quiet in ways that could be difficult to read, particularly when something was bothering him. He had a habit of going interior instead of outward with trouble, working through it alone until he'd resolved enough of it to be useful in conversation. And there were days early in the winter when she found that habit genuinely maddening. She told him so, once, in January, after 3 days of watching him carry something she couldn't identify. "You do this thing," she said at dinner. "You take a problem, and you go inside with it, and you don't come back until you've already decided what to do about it." He looked up from his plate. "That's a bad thing?" "It's a lonely thing," she said, "for the person watching." He held her gaze. Something worked across his face. "I'm not used to having someone watching." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The drainage channel on the north fence line is going to fail before spring. I've been trying to figure out whether to repair it in February or wait and deal with the flooding in March." She looked at him. "That's what you've been carrying for 3 days?" "It's a significant decision." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Tell me about it. I'll help you think through it." He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as surprised. Not the large surprise of unexpected news, but the small, ongoing surprise of a man who keeps discovering that shared thinking works better than he'd been operating on the assumption it would. "All right," he said. They talked about the drainage channel for an hour and solved the problem before the coffee was gone, which was, she thought, not really about the drainage channel at all. In February, a letter came over the North Ridge, carried by a rider from Garrison who'd taken the hard way up, specifically because the primary trail was still weeks from passable. The rider, a young man named Pete, who worked for the Garrison postmaster, and had the cheerful resilience of someone who hadn't yet learned that certain things were supposed to be difficult, arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon and accepted coffee with visible relief, and produced a bundle of letters from under his coat. 3 were for Caleb, ranch business, a parts order from a supplier in Cheyenne. 4 were for Delilah. She read them in order of postmark. 2 were from Albright's office, routine updates, the ongoing work of hearings and depositions, and the slow grinding progress of federal proceedings against the remaining members of Whitlock's legal network. 1 was from a woman in Philadelphia she'd known slightly, a former colleague from the shipping firm, who had heard what happened and written to say she was glad. The 4th was from Baltimore. The handwriting on the outside was her mother's. She'd written to her family in October, the first letter since she'd left Philadelphia. She'd kept it plain. She was in Wyoming. She was safe. She was working. She'd said nothing about Whitlock or the documents or the fight on the mountain because some things needed to be said in person or not at all. She'd given Caleb's address. Her mother's letter was 2 pages in a hand that had gotten shakier since she last remembered it, and it covered the things that mother's letters cover: her brothers, the neighborhood, the price of coal. And it ended with a paragraph that Delilah read 3 times before she put the letter down. "I don't entirely understand what you've been doing out there, but a man came to the door last month who said he was with the federal government and that you had been very brave and that some families were getting their property back because of something you did. He didn't explain it well, and I didn't follow all of it, but I want you to know I wasn't surprised. You were always the kind of person who couldn't walk past a wrong thing. Your father was the same way. It cost him sometimes. I think it costs you too. But I've stopped thinking that's something that needs fixing." Delilah sat at the cabin table with the letter in her hands, and outside the window the February mountain was white and still and enormous. She heard Caleb come in from the barn, heard him stamp snow off his boots, heard him pause in the main room. She didn't say anything. He came to the kitchen doorway and looked at her. He read her, the way he'd learned to read her over these months, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Good letter or bad letter?" "Good," she said. Her voice was steady. "My mother's." He came and sat across from her. She passed him the last paragraph without explanation. He read it. He set it down and looked at it for a moment. "She's right," he said. "About which part?" "All of it." He looked up at her. "It does cost you, and it doesn't need fixing." She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them, the letter, the window full of mountain winter. "Caleb," she said. "Yes, I want to stay." She said it plainly, without ornament, the way she'd learned to say things that mattered. "Not because the trail is blocked and I have nowhere to go. I want to stay because this is where I want to be." He looked at her for a long moment. In his gray eyes, something that had been very still for a long time moved. "I know," he said. "You know," she repeated. "That's all you have?" I was waiting, he said, for you to know it too. She looked at him. At the absolute calm of him, the steadiness that she'd initially read as distance and had spent months discovering was something else entirely. Not absence of feeling, but the presence of a person who had decided a long time ago to only say things he was certain of. How long have you been waiting? She asked. He considered. Since approximately the second week, he said. When you got your boots stuck in the creek mud and you were annoyed at the mud, not at me. She stared at him. You decided in the second week. I decided, he said, with the careful precision that meant he was being completely honest, that I wanted you to stay. Whether you stayed was always going to be your decision. She sat with that. The fire in the hearth ticked softly. Hatch shifted under the bench. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I'm going to keep having opinions about things. I've noticed, he said. I found it mostly useful. Mostly. The corner of his mouth moved. The drainage channel solution was good. She almost laughed. She put her mother's letter back in its envelope and set it on the table, and she looked at Caleb Ryder across the lamp, and she thought about every decision that had led from a stage in Garrison to this kitchen in February, every hard thing and right thing and costly thing, and she thought that her father had been the kind of person who couldn't walk past a wrong thing, and that it had cost him, and that it had cost her too, and that sitting here on the far side of all of it with this specific man across this specific table, she would not have traded a single piece of the cost for an easier road that led somewhere else. All right, she said. He nodded once. Then he stood up and started making dinner. What? Spring came the way it always does in the high mountains. Not gently, not in a single decided moment, but in pieces. 2 steps forward and 1 back. A warm week followed by a late snow followed by the first real thaw that finally meant something. The limestone shelf that had come down on the main trail in April of the previous year was still a landscape of white and gray rubble below the tree line, and the Territorial Road Commission had already sent a letter saying that reconstruction of the trail was not expected until summer at the earliest. The North Ridge route, which Pete the postal rider had been cheerfully navigating all winter, was now clear enough for regular traffic. People began to come up the mountain, not many, at first. A neighbor rancher from the Eastern Valley who'd heard what happened and came to see for himself. A woman from Garrison named Clara, who ran the dry goods and who arrived with a basket in the direct manner of someone who has decided to form an opinion and wanted the primary source. 2 men from Albright's office who needed Delilah's signature on 3 different sets of documents and who stayed for dinner because Caleb offered and the ride back down was long. Then, in May, Margaret Holt came. She arrived with her daughter, a woman in her 40s named Ruth, who had the look of someone who had been worried for a very long time and was only now beginning to consider stopping, and a neighbor who'd driven them from the stage in Garrison because neither of the women had managed horses since Lancaster. They arrived in the early afternoon on a Wednesday, and Delilah saw them coming up the trail from the cabin window and stood very still for a moment before she went outside to meet them. Margaret Holt was small and white-haired and moved carefully the way people move when their joints have been complaining for years. And she walked up to Delilah on the cabin path and took both of her hands in hers and looked at her with the direct, undecorated eyes of a woman who had survived enough that she didn't have patience for anything less than the truth. You're the one who did it, she said. It wasn't a question. I had help, Delilah said. I know, but you started it. Margaret Holt held her hands and looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained several things at once. Gratitude, yes, but also something more complicated than gratitude. The particular feeling that comes when something you'd stopped believing was possible has happened anyway. I've been on that farm for 34 years now. I thought I'd lost it forever. Delilah looked at this 66-year-old woman holding her hands on a mountain path in Wyoming, and she thought about the entry in Whitlock's ledger. Holt, Lancaster. 11,000, settled. And the way she'd read that entry for the first time 2 years ago at her desk in Philadelphia and felt the shape of it like a cold thing against her ribs. I'm glad you're back on it, Delilah said. That was all. It was enough. They had dinner on the porch because the evening was warm enough, and the view from Caleb's mountain was the kind of view that made conversation better just by being there. Ruth turned out to be funny in a dry, understated way that Delilah took to immediately, and Margaret asked Caleb 3 questions about his drainage channel system that were more technically specific than most people managed, and Hatch distributed his considerable goodwill evenly across all guests, which Delilah had come to understand was as reliable an endorsement as any. After dinner, when the light was going golden on the upper ridge, and Ruth and the neighbor were loading the wagon, Margaret Holt stood beside Delilah at the porch rail and looked at the mountain. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "With all of it settled?" Delilah thought about the question honestly. "Stay here," she said. "Keep doing what needs doing." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You gave up a lot to do what you did." "Yes. You could have walked away. You were smart enough to walk away." "I know," Delilah said. "I couldn't." The older woman looked at her sideways. "No, I don't suppose you could." She turned back to the view. "My husband used to say that some people are built with the inconvenience of a conscience. He meant it as a compliment, even though it never sounded like one." She paused. He was right. Delilah looked at the mountain in the evening light, at the ridge where the limestone used to be, the raw new scar of it already beginning to soften at the edges as the season did what seasons do to the things that get broken. "Tell me about the farm," she said, and Margaret Holt told her about the farm, the 34 years of it, the work, and the seasons, and her husband who had built the house with his own hands, and she talked until the wagon was loaded, and Ruth called out that the light was going and they needed to start down. And when she climbed into the wagon, she looked back at Delilah on the porch, and she said simply and without ceremony, "Thank you." Delilah lifted a hand. She watched the wagon go down the path until it turned into the trees and disappeared, and then she stood alone on the porch for a while in the evening quiet. And she thought about what it meant to have done a thing that could not be undone, in the best possible sense of that. A thing that was now part of the permanent record of what had happened in the world, that could not be taken back or renegotiated or settled out of existence by a lawyer with a forged deed. Caleb came out and stood beside her. He handed her a cup of coffee and looked at the trail where the wagon had gone. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. They stood there a while in the easy silence that had taken months to build and now felt entirely natural. "There's a letter from Albright's office," he said eventually. "Came up with Pete this morning. I didn't give it to you earlier because you had your hands full." "What does it say?" "Carver's been removed from the bench. 2 of Whitlock's attorneys have entered guilty pleas. And," he paused in a way that told her the last part was the significant one, "7 more restitution orders have been issued. 3 of them are in Pennsylvania. 4 are in New York. 11 total now, with the 3 from October. 20 properties returned, or in the process of being returned, to the people who'd lost them." She thought about the names in the ledger, the ones she'd memorized, the ones she'd carried in her head for months like stones. She thought about how heavy stones were, and how different the world looked when you put them down. "There are still names on that list," she said. "There are," he said. "Albright said the proceedings for the remaining cases will take another 8 or 9 months. He'll need your testimony twice more, probably." "I know." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I'll be there." He looked at her. "I know you will." The light on the upper ridge had gone from gold to the deep rose and gray of a mountain sunset, and the air was cooling fast the way mountain air does when the sun drops. And in the barn, one of the horses made the low, satisfied sound of an animal that has been fed and is at peace with its circumstances. It occurred to Delilah, standing there, that she was not afraid. Not as a temporary condition, not as the absence of a specific threat, but in some deeper structural way. The fear that had been running underneath everything for years, the fear that had been present even before Whitlock, the particular anxiety of a woman who had spent her whole adult life understanding that she was one bad decision or one piece of bad luck away from having nothing, had changed into something else. She couldn't name it exactly. It wasn't confidence in the conventional sense. She was too honest to claim certainty about the future, too acquainted with how quickly things could change. But it was something solid, something that had been built out of the past year the way the cabin had been built out of timber and stone and sustained effort. Not perfect, not without drafts and rough edges, but real and standing and hers. "Caleb," she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. At this man she'd been looking at for a year now, who had walked across a street in Garrison because someone needed it, and had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and something in those gray eyes was steady and certain and very, very clear. He set down his coffee cup on the porch rail. He turned to face her properly. He was not elegant about it. He had not rehearsed some speech. He said what he meant in the direct, unfussy way that characterized everything about him. "Stay here," he said. "Not just for the season. Stay here and be my wife, if you want that." She looked at him. At the scar on his left arm, still visible, from the rock fragment. At the gray in his hair and the weathered lines of his face, and the work-roughened hands that had taught her to split wood and set a rifle and place a charge in a limestone fracture and 100 other things she'd needed to know. At the man who'd said we'll deal with it before he knew what it was, and had meant every word. "I want that," she said. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood on the porch as the last of the light left the ridge and the first stars showed themselves above the mountain, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more about it. The wedding was in June, on the flattest piece of ground near the cabin, in the morning when the light was good. It was not elaborate. Clara from Garrison came and brought her husband and the dry goods and a cake that had survived the trail in better condition than anyone expected. Pete the postal rider came because he'd been going up and down that mountain all winter and felt entitled. Ruth Holt came without her mother, who had sent a letter and a jar of preserves from the Lancaster farm. The neighbor from the Eastern Valley came with his wife, who brought flowers she'd grown herself and distributed them with the mild authority of a woman who has opinions about how things should look. A circuit magistrate named Foster, who had not, Delilah had confirmed, ever taken money from anyone, performed the ceremony on the grass with the mountain behind them, and Hatch, sitting with great dignity at the edge of the gathering as though he'd been specifically assigned to it. It was not the wedding that a girl from Baltimore with a father who was a clerk and a mother who worried might have imagined for herself. There was no white dress, there was no church, no pew, no organ playing something solemn and approved. There was no family except the people who had come to be family in the hardest possible way. It was, she thought, considerably better. Foster asked the necessary questions and they gave the necessary answers, and when it was done, Caleb put a ring on her finger that had belonged to his grandmother and was slightly too large and would need to be sized down, which was a real thing that happened, and which she found she loved specifically because it was imperfect and true. And then the people who had come up the mountain ate the cake and drank the coffee and talked in the way of people who are genuinely glad to be somewhere, and the morning went on for a long time before anyone felt like leaving. At one point, Delilah found herself standing with Clara from the dry goods, a little apart from the others, looking at the view that she'd been looking at for a year now, and which still had the power to make her stop thinking for a moment and just look. "You know what they say about you in town," Clara said. She was a direct woman and said it conversationally, not as accusation. "I can imagine. They say you're the woman who brought down Whitlock." Clara looked at the mountain. "Some of them mean it critically, the ones who don't like the idea of a woman doing something like that. But most of them," she paused, "most of them say it the way they say it about someone they're proud of, even if they never told you that." Delilah looked at Garrison, invisible below the tree line, a town that had looked at her with cold calculation when she stepped off a stage in which had become, in the strange mathematics of a year's events, something closer to home than she'd expected. "I wasn't trying to be anyone's story," she said. "I know," Clara said. "That's probably why you are." In the years that followed, the last of Albright's cases resolved, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular frustrations of legal systems that move at their own pace, regardless of anyone's urgency. 2 of Whitlock's attorneys served prison terms. One fled to Europe and was not extradited. Judge Carver died before his trial concluded, which was not the resolution anyone had wanted, but was a kind of resolution nonetheless. The remaining restitution orders were issued one by one over the course of 14 months, until the last name on Delilah's list, a widow in upstate New York named Helen Marsh, received back the 4 lots her late husband had left her, and which had been stripped from her through a forged title dispute in 1873. Delilah received a letter from Helen Marsh in the spring of the second year, written in an old woman's hand that was shaky but precise. It said, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. I had stopped expecting justice. I think that's what they count on, that we'll stop expecting it. I'm glad you didn't." She kept that letter. She kept all of them, in a box on the shelf in the room that had been her room when she first arrived and had since become a workroom. A space with a writing desk and the view of the mountain she'd woken to every morning for a year before it became simply the view, the thing you see when you look up. So familiar that you stop noticing it except on the days when the light is particular and you remember to look. The homestead changed the way things change when they're being actively lived in. A second outbuilding went up in the second summer. The pasture fence was repaired properly, the way Caleb had been meaning to do for 3 years. Delilah planted a kitchen garden in the third spring that was, by her own admission, a mixed success. The beans came in well, the squash was adequate, and the attempt at tomatoes at this altitude was ambitious enough that they discussed it periodically as a cautionary tale. Hatch turned gray around the muzzle and developed a preference for sleeping on a specific rag rug in front of the hearth that everyone recognized as his and worked around accordingly. People came up the mountain. Not constantly, not in a way that changed the fundamental character of the place, but with the regularity of people who have decided somewhere matters to them. Ruth Holt came twice a year and brought news from Lancaster. Clara from the dry goods became, improbably and genuinely, a friend. Women from the valley below sometimes came with specific questions, practical questions, legal questions, the kind of questions that women had historically had nowhere to take, and which Delilah answered as accurately and completely as she was able, because that was what you did when you had information that could help someone and they needed it. She never stopped thinking of herself as the woman who had taken those ledger pages from Whitlock's office. Not because she needed the identity, but because the act had been true. The truest thing she'd ever done. The thing that had cost the most and returned the most. And there was no reason to pretend it hadn't happened or to minimize it out of some misplaced modesty about the enormity of it. She'd been afraid. She wanted to be clear about that, to herself first and to anyone who asked. She'd been afraid from the moment she slid those 47 pages out of the filing cabinet and put them in the leather satchel, and she'd stayed afraid for a long time afterward. The fear had not gone away cleanly or heroically. It had just, over time, become smaller than the thing she'd chosen to do instead. That was the only wisdom she'd take from any of it, the only thing she'd claim to know for certain. Not that courage was the absence of fear, which she'd heard before and found useless, but that fear and determination could occupy the same body at the same time, and that which one drove you was entirely up to you. She'd chosen to be driven by what mattered. She still chose it, every day, in the smaller ways that most days required. It wasn't dramatic anymore. Most of it was firewood and letters and garden beds and the ongoing negotiation of a life shared with another person, which had its own demands and its own satisfactions and its own particular brand of difficulty that was nothing like fighting and everything like building. Caleb was, as it turned out, a person who got better over time. Not easier, exactly. He still went interior with problems before he came outward, still had to be reminded occasionally that shared thinking existed and was available to him. But there was a quality in him, a bedrock solidity of character, that she'd recognized on a street in Garrison and had been confirmed by every year since. He was not going to change into someone else. He was not going to become someone she didn't recognize. I was going to be exactly who he was, indefinitely, and who he was someone she wanted beside her. She had not expected that. She'd spent years operating on the assumption that love, if it came, would arrive as a complication, something that cost more than it returned, something to be navigated carefully and held at a manageable distance. She'd watched her mother love her father through poverty and early death, and had drawn cautious conclusions. She'd been wrong. Love was not a complication. It was the place you stood when everything else had been stripped away, and it held or it didn't, and the only thing that determined which was whether the person you'd chosen was made of what you thought they were made of. Caleb Ryder was made of exactly what she'd thought. One evening in the third autumn, sitting on the porch in the last of the good weather before the season turned, he said, out of the unrelated silence they'd been sitting in comfortably for 20 minutes. Do you miss it? Miss what? Philadelphia. The work. What you had before. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to think about things she'd lost. She thought about the office and the precise, competent world of a professional woman who knew exactly what she was doing and was good at it. She thought about steam heat and paved streets and the restaurant on Chestnut Street where she'd occasionally treated herself to lunch. Sometimes, she said, parts of it. He nodded. He looked at the ridge. Do you regret it? He asked. Any of it. She looked at the mountain in the late autumn light, at the scar on the lower ridgeline where the limestone shelf had been, now grown over at the margins with the tough small plants that colonized broken rock, not healed exactly, but inhabited, changed permanently into something new that was neither the thing it had been before nor the raw wound it had been immediately after, but a third thing, its own thing, that had come out of the fracture. No, she said, not a day. He reached out and took her hand the way he did sometimes, without announcement. She held it. The mountain received the evening the way it received everything. Vast and indifferent and permanent, older than anything either of them would ever understand. The stars came out above the ridge, and the fire inside was warm through the cabin window. And somewhere down in the valley, a coyote was working on a question that nobody was going to answer. Delilah Mercer, Delilah Ryder now, though she kept both names because both were true, sat on a porch on a Wyoming mountain in the third year of a life she had built out of the wreckage of a different one. And she was not the woman who had stepped off a stage in Garrison with nothing but nerve and a satchel full of evidence. She was something more than that. Something she hadn't had a name for when she arrived and didn't need to name now, because it wasn't a category or a title or a story that someone else told about her. It was simply who she was. The frontier had not made her into someone else. It had just finally given her enough space and enough silence and enough hard necessary work to become exactly who she had always been, underneath the fear and the running and the weight of everything she'd been carrying. That was the thing she'd been looking for, all along. Not safety, not victory, just herself. She'd found her.